Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Welcome back to the show. Today we have Matt Baker. He's the SVP of Corporate Development and International at FreshBooks. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I've been a long time FreshBooks user myself, so know the product, understand the product, and when I got approached to have you on the show, I was like, of course, I love talking to people that I've actually used their products, especially for a number of years. But maybe before we get into your role in FreshBooks, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I'm from what I would call suburban Michigan,
Okay.
outside of Detroit.
Very cool. So you went to university. What did you take and why?
Well, it's one of those things. It's like, how informed are you when you choose? I ultimately got a degree in English. And what I found was I had started in a business program, and business is ultimately in a way what, my career has gone towards, but I found it a bit too dry for what I was just interested in at the time. And I gravitated more towards classes where I thought the content was a little bit more interesting. I think ultimately, when I look back on it now, what the English degree set me up for was just getting more comfortable writing and doing so in a critical or sort of analytical way. So it's a lot of essay writing and, proving arguments and things of that. And, when I was growing up, I generally tested better in math than any other subject. So I think in some ways, choosing something like English, well, I liked it because, you could read books and then write an essay about the book kind of thing. But I think it helped me just be a little bit more well-rounded and able to communicate a little bit more strongly than just kind of focusing on, the financial side of something, math or business or what have you.
No, that's actually really interesting because you spend so much time, obviously, writing, especially when you're in business. And I think a lot of people struggle to write, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I even think, one of the things that I often have to do is write a proposal. Now, this
Sure.
proposal can be about, some new business relationship. It could be about some company that I think we should acquire. It could be about some new market we should enter. But that proposal, in a lot of ways, its ability to be persuasive and influence others is based on the writing. You could structure it a lot of different ways in terms of the background and the recommendation and the rationale, et cetera. But your ability to get your thoughts across in a concise way makes a huge difference in my mind. And some people do it better with a pen, and some people do it better sort of talking. But that sort of being able to put together an argument really is how things get done a lot of times.
No, I 100% agree with you. So you get out of university. Walk us through your career up into FreshBooks and actually getting your MBA.
Yeah, I'd certainly be happy to share a little bit of that and try to give you the Cliffs notes on that one.
Sure.
So, I sort of was in this boat where when I finished, I kind of thought jobs would just be available, and it's a little bit naive, certainly looking back on it, but I just didn't realize what it would take to go out and find these jobs. I just, assumed that there'd be more people coming to campus and offering jobs and things of that nature. And while there was some of that, I didn't find any of it particularly interesting. And particularly in Michigan, it's a lot of automotive work. And I have family members that have done that through the generations. And so at that time in particular, the automotive industry was a bit stale. And so, I just wanted something a little bit more exciting. What I ended up choosing to do was go to Europe. And I wanted to, since I had an English degree, I didn't really want to be a teacher full time, but I thought, I could teach English, and that's a way to get into that space and spend some time. So I actually spent 2 years in France. I was an English teacher at high school in two different areas, and it was great in a lot of ways. Just to sort of, it was humbling in the sense of immersing yourself in another culture and not really speaking the language and things like that. I had studied Spanish when I was in high school and university, so a bit of a leap to get there. And I found it challenging, but also rewarding. And certainly, though, after 2 years, I felt like I got a chance to travel through Europe and just feel like I knew the world a little better. But ultimately as well, I felt like I didn't really have a career. So it was like, I got to get back and, figure out what's next on the horizon. And when I came back, is when I first moved to the West Coast. And, I was just fascinated by the tech industry because it seemed like things were moving so quickly. And so that's where my career took me next. Luckily, I met some folks and found an entryway into Google. And this was back in, roughly 2005. And so I ended up spending 4 or 5 years at Google. And that was where I got into the whole space of SaaS, like software as a service, with subscription pricing, with software that serves small businesses. That whole market is where, market is where I got my experience at Google. And that's, in a lot of ways, what led me to a place like FreshBooks eventually, is that it's a similar type of business model in a similar market. And after Google, I'd gone back, but that's when I decided to do the MBA that you had mentioned. And part of that rationale was I just felt like there was some sort of leadership and business skills that were needed to run these companies at scale. And I just didn't have much exposure to that at all. So I felt like, going back to school was a great way to get that exposure. And then when I got out of there, I did some consulting for a little while, which again is just more of kicking the can down the road and not deciding exactly what you're going to do, but it allows you to, work with a bunch of different other companies. And then after a couple of years of that is finally, that's about 5 years ago now. And that's when I decided, what I really liked back in the Google days was being in this small business software space and tech company. I really liked that. And then what I really liked in this consulting space was, making important decisions, or at least helping to make important decisions for companies. And if I could find a way to bring those two together in one role, that would be pretty exciting. And that's ultimately when I joined FreshBooks to do a role in corporate strategy was my first sort of gig at FreshBooks. And it was, at that time, a company of 200 people. And, it was a great opportunity to bring what I knew about the market, but also try to help influence the overall strategy of the company.
No, very cool. So how did you get a job at FreshBooks, and walk us through your journey in FreshBooks, because you've had a few roles there now over the years that you've been there?
Yeah, well, certainly just in terms of getting in the door, one of the things I looked at back at that time about 5 years ago was I was living in Toronto at the time, and I was looking at who had raised venture capital as a signal to me that, they were looking to grow and they might find someone with my background useful. And so FreshBooks had, just that 6 months ago or so from the time I'd reached out to them, they had just, raised their first, round of venture capital. And luckily they were looking for someone that could help with strategy. And they kind of realized that's, that could be helpful to them as they went through that fundraising process. They realized that, that there's some strategic questions that they'd like to, get clearer on or work through. And so luckily that fit, and it was pretty common for a lot of people who were in the consulting industry to move into strategy roles. So that was a great way to make the transition initially back into a tech company. And then what I found over time there is I started, as we mentioned, in the corporate strategy role, which is advising a lot of units, and then part of the business units. And then a couple of years later, when I started to move more directly into having some operational oversight into these various units, and so I've taken on some new functions. Like at one point, I was responsible for the PR team, which was a new, sort of functional area for me, which is, interesting to learn about. But at the same time, I brought a different sort of perspective to it, which, hopefully was helpful. And we made a big push into doing things like that we would call data PR, which is using our data to tell narratives out in the market. And, that certainly is pretty commonplace now. Even something simple like what do people charge per hour per vertical? Is this something that, is super interesting, and it's kind of information we have and we can certainly share. So that was, a great opportunity to learn some of those. And then where it's sort of gravitated to today is, firstly, I'm responsible for our international business. And that's just, how can we grow, globally, and not just, our headquarters in Toronto and our largest, customer bases in the US, but outside of those two markets, how else, can we grow and where, and how do we have to shape what we do to effectively, be a global company? And so that's been a really exciting opportunity. And then the other big one that I'll mention is in the title there is corporate development, which is about having a process in place where we look to acquire a company that can help us in one way or another. Either, it's a piece of technology that if we acquire that, then it saves us time and we have to build it ourselves, or it's a way to get us into a new vertical or a new market, or, there's some strategies in place based on the kind of companies we look at. But that's a super interesting place. And it's always, this whole area of corporate development is always this needle in a haystack thing. So you got to really look at a lot of companies to find the one that fits, because it's got to fit, on the size of the deal. It's also got to fit timing wise. And anyway, there's a lot that's got to go right. But we've certainly learned a lot through that function.
No, very cool. So FreshBooks has been around, I think, since like 2003. And I know, like, I actually saw Mike, your CEO, a number of years ago, do this like 1 day kind of entrepreneurial kind of course at the Future of Web Apps in Las Vegas a number of years ago. So I actually got to meet him. But for people that haven't heard of FreshBooks, what do you guys do and how have you guys grown over the years?
Well, thanks for asking. And certainly, I just tell people we've been around for more than 10 years. I think, you're probably spot on with the 2003, but it's just, meant to say, we've been around for a long time. And Mike, who you met, is one of our 3 co-founders and our CEO. And he was running a web design business effectively. He had a number of clients and he was helping them with their websites to drum up business. And he was having his own trouble with invoicing. And
Sure.
At the time, he was using some basic tools like Microsoft Word to create an invoice, and then you got to resave it every time. And he found himself just making more errors and headaches than it was worth. And so he had started the first stage of building a solution for himself to try to automate some of that. And what he found out, through that process was that a bunch of his clients or colleagues said, "Oh, I'd like that too." And it turned out that he, ultimately felt like there was a bigger opportunity to build this invoicing tool than to run the web design firm. And I think that, certainly proven out the test of time quite a bit. And anyhow, so that's what we started as an online invoicing tool, sort of born in the cloud. So it was never any of this, on-premise stuff by any means. So it was in the cloud, started with online invoicing, and then we just added more features based on serving this unique group of small business owners and self-employed professionals that want to invoice for their income, for their time and expertise. And so we've added things on there like the ability to track time so you can push on an invoice, or the ability to sync a bank account so you can move some of your expenses to rebill them to clients. And ultimately we've added a whole bunch of accounting features, because at the end of the day, once you have all their invoices and you have the bank account, then you can do profit and loss statements and everything else that's needed for tax time readiness. And that's, effectively how we've grown, but we've stayed very true to the entrepreneur or the self-employed pro or the small business owner, whatever you want, whatever, title you want to give them. But that's who we serve. And it's always, the type of service-based business where eventually they're going to need to invoice for their time. So we generally don't serve a lot of retail or e-commerce or those types of business. It's really, it's a service-based entrepreneur. And anyhow, that's the part that, just hasn't has stayed the same while, we've continued to innovate in other ways.
No, I think that's very cool. And you guys were one of the first, in my opinion anyway, to actually like be able to like send an invoice and like include a PayPal or a Stripe account to just like get paid with a credit card, right? And back in the day when I was freelancing a bunch, like obviously getting paid in a relatively short period of time compared to like 60 or 30 or 90 days, right? It was nice that they could just like punch in their credit card number and you'd get paid, within a few days, right?
Yeah, so that's absolutely true. And that's the spot where, funny enough, that's a space where we're still trying to help. I mean, the average invoice gets paid late, especially if it's not being done online. So we're looking for more and more ways to offer these online payments, helping people get paid faster. That's one of our core value props. And so we're just trying to find, if somebody, you mentioned like PayPal is a good example. That's like an online wallet versus does somebody want to pay with a credit card, or do they just want to pay, with their bank account, like a debit type of transaction. And so we're continuing to introduce new ways to make that payment, more seamless and easy. And it's a little bit of threading the needle, so to speak, of, we want to find the payment options that the small business owners themselves want to, enable. And then we also have to find the options that the client at the end of the day is willing to to use because, particularly if you were doing some of that freelance work that you mentioned, if you're working for a large company, then they have their own, payout processes, which can take a long time and, largely, are dictated by their procurement groups and all the same. So anyway, we're just trying to break down some of those walls and just making it easier and easier to, get paid on time and consistently.
No, totally right. And then being able to track expenses related to what you're doing, or, I've been using you guys too for like even the show invoices to send for sponsors and stuff like that. And so just being able to kind of track everything in one place and pull it up on kind of your different devices, and your app works pretty well. And then the reporting right at the end of the year, you kind of just print off a whole report and you just fire it off to the accountant. And if they have questions, you answer them. But for the most part, I found the whole process from kind of day one to actually getting your taxes done at the end of the year really seamless, right? And painless.
Yeah, and what we found when we look at the market data, the U.S. is actually trailing some other markets like Australia and the U.K. in terms of adoption of software like ours, whether you call it invoicing or accounting software. And so it's around something like 1 in 3, people that you'd call a small business owner. Only about 1 in 3 are using some kind of software. So the other 2/3, they're basically, they're running spreadsheets on their own to kind of track this stuff, or they got a bunch of folders where they're doing it, or they got a notebook where they're logging things, and or it's just in a bunch of individual apps that don't really connect into one thing. So certainly we just strongly believe that more and more people are going to come online and see that just putting this stuff online is super helpful. And so for us, it's some of our simplest features, like when you send an invoice, we will automatically send reminders for you. That's just one nice example of automation that it's just it's almost like once you have that, why would you ever walk away from it? And so, and by the way, we're not the only ones to do it. Lots of them do it now. But the point is, if you don't have any online, accounting solution or such, you end up doing a lot of manual work. So anyhow, we believe that we can still help lots of folks they're still on the manual side of things.
Sure. Well, and even just the entrepreneurs using your system as well, right? Just not having to send reminders to get paid, right? Like usually when you're small as an entrepreneur, sometimes it's just you yourself doing everything, right? And so the more you can automate or offload to third-party tools like FreshBooks, it just makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I just, part of the reason that I really like this space a lot is I'm inspired by small business owners that have to wear all those hats. I mean, they really have to be, the CFO and the lead salesperson and the lead, doer of executing the work. And anyhow, any role you can think of, they got to do that. So the more that there's automation, certainly the more that we help small businesses succeed, and they're a huge part of the economy. And so, for all those reasons, hopefully, and by the way, I think all the tools out there are getting better and better each year. So I think that's a great sign.
Sure. So then how does it work going from being maybe like an entrepreneur or a small team to actually using your team's version of FreshBooks? Like what's the transition? Is there a transition? And what's the similar and different between, kind of your two different plans? Well, I guess it's more than that, but what is similar and different about being an individual compared to a team using FreshBooks?
Okay. I follow you on that one. I think that, the way that I think about it is it's just an extension of the individual. So if we start with the individual, every business has an owner, right? And that owner, is who we solve for at the core of who do we build this application for? Well, we built it for the business owner. And so there's so many things that, that we're trying to enable them to be able to do easier, or, through automation or what have you. And then as a value add to that, what we're trying to say is, okay, now link in all the people that you need to work with. I mean, certainly you link in your clients because you're sending them invoices, but you can also link in a client to collaborate on a project. You can add an employee, and then you can decide which permissions you want that employee to be able to do. Or you can add a contractor, which is sort of more like a non-employee, but somebody who's still doing work for you. And you can certainly even invite your accountant. So I look at it more like those are roles in the network, and you can decide what you want to do. But lots of people, when they add their employees, for instance, what they have their employees do is track time against projects, because ultimately then somebody is responsible for billing out on all the project or the client work,
Right.
or they have their employees, if not logging time, then they log expenses. So use it as a way to get all the expenses into one place for their work. And so anyway, it's use cases like that that enables the team to collaborate on client work at the end of the day.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's very cool. So where do you guys kind of see the space going, or do you have any predictions? Like you mentioned, more and more people are going to come online, and that, I think, obviously drives what you guys are doing. So how do you decide what features to keep the platform relevant, but also make sure that you don't just bloat the thing with every wild request that people have for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating one, and the one that our product managers are struggling with, every day. And one of the lessons I learned at Google when I was there at the time was, if you just listen to the feedback from customers and you just do exactly what they say, oftentimes you'll miss, the things that you'd call visionary, or the things
Right.
that are that they need, that they don't even know they need. So I think you do have to find the right trade. I mean, you absolutely have to listen to your customers, and we do a lot of customer interviews, but it can't be, you can't necessarily just give them the reins and say, what do you want us to do? So you have to have a bit of a vision of what you're trying to accomplish. And the way that we think about that, I mean, certainly when you mention trends, I think that the small business, in the U.S. at least, the census says there's something around 30 million small businesses. 6 million of those have employees, and so the other 24 million don't. And then there's other reports out there that say as much as 50, 60 million people in the U.S. are doing some kind of independent work, like a freelance thing, which means that it could be on the side of a traditional job. But those numbers are just staggering. There's lots and lots. And even when we survey people who have traditional jobs and we say, hey, how interested, are you in working for yourself? And do you really intend to become self-employed in the future? Those numbers are also staggering. It's sort of like, tens of millions of people. And so if you believe that sort of trend is coming, then it's a really exciting space to be in. And, it sort of signals to me that, perhaps the American dream in terms of your career has shifted. It's not to climb the corporate ladder or to stay at one company for 30 years. It's actually to gain more control over your career, be self-employed, take on different challenges, and sort of, set your own terms, so to speak. That seems to be more where the American dream is going. And so, what we want to do is effectively just continue to solve for that business owner, put them first, make sure that, the decisions we make are, in their best interest, and continue to, stay true to that, those verticals that we're in. So I think that's our way of trying to, stay committed to a group and not, just add, bloat for the sake of bloat. Certainly, every year our product gets, gets new features, but I think we also try to streamline and think about things that we can do that will, automate certain things entirely, so you don't have to do it anymore, or just, do it in fewer clicks and things like that. So anyway, I think it's a little bit of an ebb and flow in terms of, how you build that over time. But certainly we try to keep, our ear to the ground, so to speak, and think about what's going to be best, for the businesses, and by staying close to the businesses is effectively how we can prioritize.
No, I 100% agree with you. And I do think, especially people with an entrepreneurial mindset, definitely obviously want to work for themselves one day. And they're probably, a lot of them start part-time or a few hours a week before they actually make the jump to being fully self-employed. So what are your thoughts and advice around making people kind of, I get it's never like 100% guaranteed, because most things in life aren't, but how do you kind of de-risk that move from, say, your steady job with a steady paycheck into being self-employed? Do you have any advice around that?
Well, I certainly really like this, the idea of a side hustle, doing something part-time. I think it's a great way to test your ability to deliver on that concept,
Sure.
to test, how much you actually like that work, to test, is it as fulfilling, or is it as, worthwhile as you think? So I really like this idea of a side hustle. What I would say to folks is, think of it as a temporary thing. I mean, nobody really starts a side hustle that says, oh, I'd love to just work 2 jobs instead of 1. Really,
Sure.
what you're testing is your ability to do that sort of full time. But I think, this idea of, treading into it lightly is a way of, de-risking it, right? Because I think a lot of times what we see, is that in the small business market, lots of small businesses, it's just factual. Lots of small businesses fail every year.
Sure.
And, some of that is, largely uncontrollable. Some of that, though, if there was a bit of a test in market, you might be able to, change your model a bit so that you'd be more successful, or you might realize, hey, this isn't quite, as strong as I thought it was going to be. I got to, figure out a different path. So for what it's worth, I really like the test as long as you can keep it, defined in time, just so it doesn't feel like you're just doing this extra thing in perpetuity. And then on top of that, I think there's some specific, things that we see when we talk to people about, are you, ready to go and do it? And people say, okay, well, here's some of the barriers. And so, that often tends to be things like, do I have enough money to do this? And so, one simple way is to, think through that a little bit, but have a bit of savings. And sometimes it's not savings to start the business, because maybe it's one of these businesses that, if you're going to be a consultant, you can just start doing that for the most part. But you might need savings that you can live off of for a few months until you get that business going. And so that's a way to think about, reducing a barrier there. So anyway, test it out, have some savings. The other thing that we hear a lot is, people concerned about health insurance. And so that's something that, is maybe not the easiest thing to solve, but certainly you can look into it in advance. You can check out, healthcare.gov or some of these other places and see what you're really signing up to. By the way, most programs or most employers, if you're making the switch, you can move on to like a temporary program of theirs in the short term, but you still got to fix it, eventually. So
sure.
The sooner you get your head around that, the better. And then, one other big group I'll mention is just really interesting is this barrier around people worried about inconsistent income. And frankly, it's a good worry to have because it's accurate. But one way to de-risk is to think through what that might look like for your business. And the term that I often use is that your income will be lumpy. And what that means is that in most traditional jobs, you get paid every 2 weeks or, twice a month, and you might have an end of year bonus or something like that. But for the most part, there's stability there that you can rely on. And then once you start working for yourself, more or less that all goes out the window.
Right.
And so you got to think through a little bit of what's that going to look like. And it's just a way of de-risking it. So if your typical project that you're going to work on for somebody, if it's a 2-month project, let's say, you got to understand, like, okay, you're going to have multiple going any time so that every month you're still finishing one, or you need to, start, doing milestone payments so that you're not waiting till the end of every project to get paid.
Right.
There's other solutions you can put out there, but I think this idea of thinking about what is the income going to look like, especially if it's a seasonal business or something of that nature, you just got to think about smoothing it out. And anyhow, I think it's one other way to de-risk. I mean, it's funny to me that having gone through some financial training myself, a good example is a public school teacher. They, generally work 9 months a year, or 10, however you think of the summer. Right. And then they have an option where they'll get paid when they work, or they can smooth it out and get paid over 12 months.
Right.
And from all the people that I've talked to, they always choose the 12-month one. And it's because they want the consistency of it. But if you were really, thinking of it from a financial standpoint, you would want your money sooner, because the sooner you have your money, the more it's worth. Right. If you're delaying that money, there's a time associated with that. And so don't want to go too deep on that, but it's just, it's sort of not the most rational decision, but it gives you peace of mind. And so I just think that that's an important thing to recognize, that this lumpiness is hard to swallow. And so just, when you think about de-risking, it's going into that eyes wide open, but also thinking about how you can smooth it out a bit.
No, that's actually really good advice. And the other thing that I've learned, like within the last few years, is majority of the biggest companies that have ever existed, that are even still around today, like Apple and Google and even like Ford, like all started as a side hustle. Like they worked other jobs at the beginning. And so I always find it interesting when investors are like, you need to be all in. It's like, well, not everybody has the option to always be all in, right? And it's like, turning the tables on an investor, it's kind of like, well, they're not putting all their money on you. So like, and especially if you're bootstrapping, right? Like depending on how you choose to go into self-employment, whether you're taking money or not taking money, sometimes you don't really have the option, right? And I think just putting it into perspective, like trying to figure out milestones to get paid faster or have a little bit of money come in while you're working in a second job. And like you said, maybe set a goal saying, if I'm not making X amount of dollars after 6 months or a year, then I need to reevaluate if I still want to keep doing this or not. But I think it's just getting people to think about some of the things that they think of these big hurdles, right? Where they're not as big in a lot of cases as people think. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I like your point about how most of these, companies that you've looked into, it started as something that was a side project, and it started as an idea that someone had, but it wasn't, what they immediately came out of school doing or what they immediately did as soon as they, decided to enter the workforce. And so these things start small, right? And then it's like you got to have some wins and you got to build it out. And so I would, anyway, for what it's worth, I agree with you 100%. And I think a lot of times, people that may say something like you got to be all in, they're probably really, that's more of, what's on the surface. But if you think of the iceberg concept, underneath the surface, there's a lot more going on there. And it's probably, they're not sure about something else, but they're kind of couching it in this idea, if you were doing it full time, maybe I'd think about it differently. But, so I think you got to be careful sometimes with the feedback that you get. But certainly, I think if you have an idea and you get it out there and then you can see momentum and you can see yourself building, as long as you're continuing to grow, you'll get to the point where you do it full time. Like nothing will stop you doing that. So I think it's more around, you got to find something that you feel like you can invest time and effort into, and it will in turn become this bigger thing. And that's ultimately where that growth comes from. And whether it takes you, 2 months or 2 years to grow it, that's kind of more, based on, what you're willing to put in.
No, I 100% agree with you. So I guess if that many people want to be self-employed in the next few years or sometime in their career, should kind of businesses be worried that a bunch of people are going to leave them? Or how do they make sure that maybe they incubate the entrepreneurial spirits in their companies to make sure they stay so they can both win? Like, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, I absolutely think employers should be worried. I think there's two sides to that coin, and maybe just start with the first one, sure. Which is certainly I think they should be worried. And what I've seen in the market, is that one is that so your commitment to your employer, I think, has gone down through this generation compared to the baby boomers or something like that. But that's also structurally true because you don't have pensions the same way. It's this defined contribution versus that you get it's more like a retirement plan versus they're going to pay your retirement. And it's just seen a lot more acceptable to switch around from one job to another. And so I just think that inherently people are much more comfortable moving around. And so I think, for what it's worth, a lot of employers should be a bit concerned about that. What are we really doing to keep our employees? And then but I also see some things happening like remote work is getting a lot more acceptable.
Right.
And so when I looked at the data, so one of the things we do every year, we do a sort of a big study of people who have jobs, who have traditional jobs and self-employed jobs, and we go through a bunch of questions. But one of the things that we look at is, why do you want to be self-employed? And I think I touched on it a little bit earlier, but it usually stems around this idea of control. I want to control my income. I want to control my hours. I want to control where I work and who I work for. And it's all this control piece. And so what I would say is, I think a lot of employers are starting to try to give that control back to their employees and make it clear to them that, you want to work from home? Okay, well, here's the process and here's how you do it. That's okay as long as it's not, every day or what have you. So I think employers are working hard to give that control back to employees, or at least the perception that they have more control than they realize. So I think a lot of that's going to help. And that's what maybe leads me to my second side of the coin that I was mentioning, which is the other thing our data showed is that of the people who want to be self-employed within the next 2 years, and that's one of the things we always ask in these surveys, more of them are coming out of a small business than one of these, what we call a larger company.
Okay.
So if small business, might be people with 20 or less, it's more likely that the person saying, hey, I want to do my own thing, I want to start my own business, it's just more likely at the moment that they're an employee of a small business versus an employee of a large corporation. And in some ways that makes sense, because small businesses, are sort of like incubators for entrepreneurship.
Right.
So, if you want to learn how to be an entrepreneur, you should go work at a small business, not a large business, because a large business is they're already at this scale where they sometimes don't even remember, how to get things started. They just know how to optimize, across the scale that they're working at now. Back at the origin of the company, certainly it was very entrepreneurial, but small businesses in a lot of ways can be incubators. So I think that's where a lot of the folks may be leaving small businesses to start their own, more so than large employees.
No, interesting. So do you have any advice around actually engaging your employees and actually maybe promoting them within, or maybe even funding and partnering with some of them on some of their entrepreneurial ideas, if it's a fit for your business, obviously?
Right. I mean, there's two things that come to mind there. I think one for me is around multiple careers, and number two is around values. And so if I'm an employer, in a lot of ways, I have employees that work on my team, and I obviously work for the company as well, but I have people that are a part of my team, and when I think about how best do I want to keep them and retain them and keep them interested and such, anyway, for what it's worth, I think into those two buckets. And so the multiple careers piece is this idea that I think it's important that people should see the ability to have multiple careers within one company. More and more, I feel like, people stay at a company for 2 or 3 years and they move on. And oftentimes that's the best way for them to increase their salary, is to find someone else who wants them versus, work their way up within the company. It's back to what I was saying before around the American dream is not so much a climbing the corporate ladder. Right. And so rather than frame it as a corporate ladder, I think one of the best opportunities to give people the ability to build multiple careers within a company. And so I think we've made a real strategic effort at FreshBooks to allow people to start in one department, like say customer service, and then move into the product department, or start in sales and move into the business development department, and effectively just take on different roles and responsibilities. And I think in a lot of ways, that's how you grow, is you get a lot of the different exposure to the different problem sets, and you become a better general manager over time by having experience in all these different groups. But I think allowing people to do that is something that most, that I would recommend that employers embrace, because as soon as, people get a little too stuck in one, I think that's when, the only way for them to get change is to leave. And then they start to sort of vote with their feet. And anyhow, I think that's a big way to promote engagement. And then the second one on the values base is just for companies to try to live their values a little bit more. Most companies have a set of values. And I would say most often, if you were to ask an employee, like, what are your company's values, that they may not know them, or if they know them, they may not say, oh, this is exactly how we use them. So I would encourage folks to just be a little bit more values based. I think it creates a deeper connection with employees around, why do I work for the company that I work for? Sometimes we get in the habit of, giving everybody a T-shirt that represents the brand of the company. But if you really want them to wear that T-shirt, they have to be, proud of what you do. And I think a lot of that starts with having a stronger connection to values. And so, for instance, like one of our values is passion. And so what we say is, it's just important that you're passionate about what you do. And if not, then you got to find the thing that you're passionate about and do it here. Hopefully you can do it at FreshBooks. But the point is, passion is, it's almost like we're trying to say it's your right to have, to be passionate about what you do. And if it's not, then we gotta talk about that. But having it a part of the value actually makes those conversations easier. Right. And so, anyhow, I just, anyway, there's a list of different values that we choose, but spending time on that. And, I worked at one company, in the past when I was in the consulting that I mentioned called, McKinsey. And once a year they would have something called Values Day, and they would dedicate a whole day once a year to just exercises and discussions about their company values. And for them, it was a different kind of importance, because they were really, really disciplined about things like confidentiality and trust of their clients, because they're often, in some pretty sensitive situations when they're advising strategically. But they cared enough about the values to make it a day event. And I think things like that can go a long way towards building a stronger connection with employees that doesn't feel so transactional, or doesn't feel like within 2 or 3 years time's up, I'm gonna go do something else.
No, that makes total sense. Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I'm curious to get your thoughts around there. At least being an entrepreneur, some people think you don't need to go to college or post-secondary, or you should just kind of come out of high school, start a business with yourself or some friends. What are your thoughts around kind of maybe skipping university and just going in and being an entrepreneur?
Well, that's I find, for what just to be clear, I guess I find it a really fascinating topic. I also want to be hesitant to lean one way too strongly or another, because I do think it varies a lot.
Sure.
But what I could say is that one of the things that we track is when we do our survey, we look at how old are you, and did you go to school or not, and where are you located, and how's your business doing. And part of the survey is looking at a bunch of that information. And what we found was that of businesses founded in the last 2 years, there was no difference in their income between whether or not they went to whether or not they had a college degree. And so what that suggests to me is that at least initially, a college degree is not the the differentiator there. Now, it could be partly because in a lot of these businesses that we serve, it tends to be skills that you don't learn in school. Now, that's not always true. I mean, but certainly if you're a social media expert, or you're developing somebody's website, or maybe you got into some kind of home services or trades, there's lots of examples where people are doing things that they didn't actually study. And so that could explain to me why we don't see that kind of difference. Now, it's hard to say that's causation, right? That's the part I just want to be careful around. Fair, it could be a bit of correlation there, but certainly I think that means that there's a real opportunity. I think the average I've seen is the average graduate from university has something more than $30,000 in debt, and so you got to think hard about taking that on. Now, I think you can de-risk, let's say, all kinds of events in your life if you have a degree, because it's just one extra thing to fall back on. But certainly, I would say, given the cost of it, given what you want to do, you can start to ask yourself, hey, is that degree the thing that's going to help me be successful, or is there different ways that I can learn and grow? Ultimately, I think a college degree can be a stamp that you passed some kind of test, that you have some baseline of knowledge, but you can certainly get that in a lot of other ways. So I'm absolutely a believer that university is not for everyone, but particularly if you don't know what you want to do, hey, you probably want to get more of an education, set yourself up for success that way.
No, I 100% agree with you. And I think the interesting thing, just being in kind of the software space for over a couple decades now, it's like I've worked with a ton of really smart people that have been successful with and without a college degree. And some of them are self-taught, some of them taking kind of evening courses, some of it's a combination of all those things, right? And I think just the big thing, it sounds like you need to figure out what works for you, but more or less schooling doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be completely successful or a complete failure. You can have kind of either one no matter what you choose, right?
Yeah, I think there's concepts out there in the world that feel like they resonate to me, particularly on this topic. So one example would be the UK is known for this concept called the gap year.
Okay.
If you're not too familiar with it, the idea is when you graduate high school, you're given 1 year called your gap year before university starts.
Yeah, I think it's smart.
And so that's a way to not just be a lifelong student, but perhaps you want to travel or what is something else you want to do. In that concept, to me, that would be a great way. If you really think you want to be an entrepreneur, well, take that year and give it a shot. And frankly, if your business takes off, then you probably just want to stick with it. But you're giving yourself an opportunity to get some real world experience, to try to get out there and sell a product or sell a service or what have you. And obviously you can do that in the summertime and all these other ways that you can try to test that out. But to me, that sounds pretty smart to get real experience before going back in, because sometimes you feel like what you're learning in school is not as helpful if you don't know how to apply it. So yeah, for those reasons, I think there's a lot of different paths out there that make sense, but that's one that, I think could have a bunch of opportunity for people.
No, interesting. Is there any advice or things that you've seen work well in small to large, even enterprise business that maybe gets their culture moving towards being more entrepreneurial? Because I think in a lot of cases, some big kind of corporations or verticals of types of business are potentially in a lot of trouble in a number of years where, technology is going to cut their staff in half or maybe into a quarter because it's got most of their stuff just can be built into software. Like, do you have any advice about maybe kind of that you've seen work in those different size companies?
Well, that's a tough one. I think it's a good question too. I mean, part of me just thinks it's like the law of nature, so to speak, of like the forest, for instance, is, it naturally, like, trees die and new ones come up, or even, oftentimes forest fires are naturally causing, and it kind of creates this room for growth. And I think a lot of times out just in the business world, that disruption is probably pretty natural, that certain companies are just not going to be 200-year-old companies, but they could have a great, run for 20 years or something like that. So sometimes it's just, you're fighting against some trend that no matter what you do, that trend is going to take over. Certainly you can see it in certain industries. But if you really want to think about adapting, and by the way, everyone should, I mean, for the most part, and you want people to help you, you want your employees and your staff to be a part of that solution. To me, it just comes down to, you have to figure out how to get rid of the fear. And so largely a mindset of, people being afraid to make mistakes, people being afraid to fail, afraid, to just maybe look bad in front of their peers. And it can be a debilitating thing. I mean, everyone, everyone has experience of where they probably felt fear, and you take less risk. Now, sometimes you can argue fear is good. If you don't have a little bit of paranoia, then maybe you don't do the extra work that's required to be successful. So, again, it's hard to take this stuff and be entirely black and white. But I think that from a cultural standpoint, if you can find a way to get people a little bit more, comfortable with risk taking, that's a good thing. Obviously, you just need guardrails, right? I mean, the history is also laden with companies that took too much risk and, created catastrophes for others. So, I just try to be as cautious as I can with some of the, with it being like an absolute answer. But I find, particularly when we're thinking about new business models and new features and, things that our customers may want, we just have to get people to get out of the fear mind space and get more into the creativity. And that's where I think a lot of those, new concepts come from.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's always interesting, right? Just having somebody like yourself that is willing to talk about this stuff. And I think at the end of the day, you basically just need to figure out what works for you and your situation, right? And everybody was willing to give you tons of advice about what you should do or don't. But at the end of the day, you basically just need to see what works for you and your company. And I think even like you guys have done that, right? You guys have grown, you guys have built other stuff, integrations, and you guys have done that really well at FreshBooks. So just, being a user for, decades now, just seeing how the platform's kind of evolved over time from the early days to kind of where it is now, right, is been cool.
Yeah. And I think just as you were describing that, the one thing that came to mind that I think is worth, sort of doubling down on just for a moment is this idea that we, all that we've done, we haven't done it ourselves, meaning partnerships are a huge part of how, we go to market and how we make sure that we try to have a whole product solution for small business owners. And so I think that concept can relate to all business sizes. And so particularly when I think about small business owners out there, I think the lesson there is just not to try to do everything yourself. Sometimes it's software like we've been talking about today, but it's oftentimes also collaboration with people that can help at different parts of the business. You may be really great at, sales, but not marketing, or you may, be terrified of going out and selling, but you are absolutely great at executing on projects. And so, figuring out how you can partner with people to help, takes a lot of that pressure off of you having to do everything. And I think that, is the same kind of concept that we've used. And I would certainly advocate that time and again.
No, that's very cool, but we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So how about we close with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself and FreshBooks?
Sure thing. At FreshBooks.com is the best place to go. All the data that I mentioned is available there. There's lots of different reports that we slice by types of entrepreneurs and gender and generation and all that sort of thing. As well as at FreshBooks.com, you can create a free trial and give it a shot. And then for me personally, I can be reached at mbakerston on Twitter, and happy to chat with anyone.
Perfect, Matt. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day, man.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.